Welcome. This is my response to essay question number 2 for essay 1. So we're going to get started on here real fast. All right, so today what we're going to be talking about is I'm going to be answering or explaining how RMP is established and what properties and characteristics of the cell membrane account for RMP's development. I'll talk about what RMP is in a minute. We'll also talk about what conditions or factors affect RMP's magnitude. Then we'll discuss what action potentials are, or what an action potential is, list its characteristics. Then we'll talk about the events of an action potential. Finally, we'll compare and contrast a graded potential with an action potential. And then we'll talk a little bit about capacitance and length constant and how myelin affects them. So we're going to get started. Like I said, RMP, we're going to talk about it here. It stands for resting membrane potential. That means where is the cell want to be. Potential means that it has potential for action, right? So RMP is normally, at least for nerve cells, negative 70 millivolts. This is where it sits. That means on the inside of the cell, if you were a little guy standing inside here and you were to look at the walls, you would see 70 negative charges sitting on the outside of the cell, right? If you're just looking at that. So what causes or what creates RMP? You have three main players that form RMP. You've got your sodium-potassium pump, you've got your potassium leak channels, and you've got negatively charged proteins on the inside of your cell. These are the things that create your resting membrane potential. So what happens is we know we have a ton of potassium. I'm just going to go back to black here. A lot of potassium on the inside of the cell and a very small amount of potassium on the outside of the cell. So the sodium-potassium pump is what creates this gradient, right? There are two different kinds of gradients, I guess three. But you've got your chemical gradient, which means that you want, so if you have a high number of some molecule, then it's going to want to go to a place that has a low number of those molecules. So high to low. High to low concentration as your chemical gradient. And then the next one that you're going to talk is the electrical gradient, which is created by charges, positives wanting to be with negatives, or vice versa, negatives wanting to be with positives, right? They're attracted to each other. They want to be together, and they don't want to be together. Positives do not want to be with positives. Negatives do not want to be with negatives. So the combination of these two things gives you an electrochemical gradient. Which is what the RMP, the resting membrane potential, is formed by this electrochemical gradient. So it's the ions are trying to go from high to low concentration, but then they also have these charges, and so these charges once they reach a certain point, they don't want to let any more of what attracts them go, if that makes sense. Trying to think of a different way of explaining it. But maybe as I just go along, it'll kind of balance out. So I'm going to kind of talk about this cell again that I drew earlier. So we have the sodium-potassium pump. We get 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. Right? So right there, it's important to remember that you will not ever have an accumulation of charge. So if you have a positive, then it has a negative partner every single time. So when I take 3 positive sodium out of the inside of my cell, that leaves behind a negative charge on the inside. That negative charge is going to move to the wall, where it's going to attract a positive on the other side of the membrane. And this is what causes that potential. So the more we stack up these negatives on the inside and positives on the outside of the cell, the more potential energy we're creating, right? Because if we suddenly open a gate that allows these positives to rush in, then that's a whole bunch of energy that we just utilized. So anyways, the sodium-potassium pump creates this electrochemical gradient by pumping out 3 sodiums and pumping in 2 potassiums. And then this potassium has a potassium leak channel where potassium can just kind of flow through. Potassium is super permeable to the cell membrane, or at least a lot more permeable than sodium. Sodium has no way of coming back in, really. It only has a voltage-gated channel. It's not permeable by itself, not like potassium is. So potassium will leak out and again leave another negative charge on the inside and a positive, and then this will come down here and be attracted to it on the outside of the cell, right? So once this is following its chemical gradient, right? It's big on the inside, small on the outside. So we said chemically, it wants to go high to low, right? And so that's what it's doing. But as more of these leave, these negatives don't want to let go of their positive buddies, right? And so it starts to balance out. So we have less positive leaving the cell. And so then we reach this equilibrium where things aren't moving out or moving in a whole lot. And so it's at rest. That RMP, resting membrane potential. So that electrochemical gradient has just been reached. So then what happens, so next we're going to talk about what conditions or factors affect RMP's magnitude. A big one is what cell are we talking about? Right now we're talking about neurons, and so they have a resting point of -70. They're excitatory. They cause things to happen, right? So we want these to be reactive. We want our body to receive signals and send those signals to where they're supposed to be so that we can react to the stimulus that's causing the action potential to happen, right? Whereas blood cells, we don't want them to be very reactive. We don't want them getting triggered at every small thing. So they're going to be clear up here at like -5 millivolts or something, right? So we don't want them to be excitable. But these -70 nerve cells, we want them to be very excitable. So that's kind of one thing that affects RMP's magnitude, the -70. And again, the resting membrane potential, what is causing this to happen, the sodium-potassium pump, the potassium leak channels, and the negative charge proteins, they're huge factors in creating the RMP's magnitude. I hope that made sense. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about what's called the Nernst equation and driving force. So the Nernst equation is E of x equals negative 61, 61 log over z times x in the cell and x out of the cell. Right, so x is the ion we're talking about. So if we're talking about potassium, right, so I'm going to put K plus here, K plus, K plus. Okay, and Z is the charge of that ion. So for potassium, we're talking about +1. Wow, +1. Right, if we're talking about calcium, it'd be +2. If we're talking about chlorine or chloride, it'd be -1. So the Nernst equation is looking at, if we're looking at one specific ion, in this case potassium, how permeable is it to the membrane, right? And what would it cause our RMP to be at? It's not looking at any other ions that might be permeable to the membrane. So it's not super helpful for us to look at it, because if we were doing potassium, the inside of the cell is like 150 inside to 5 on the outside. Right, and it's going to cause it to be a really negative number. Something like, I think I have it here, negative 90 millivolts. But that's not what we see. We see a negative 70 millivolt RMP, right? So that's why we have to talk about driving force. Driving force is basically how bad does a cell want to keep, or how bad does a cell want to get or get rid of an ion, basically. So driving force, I'm going to move that over here a little bit, is equal to your Vm, that your resting membrane potential, negative 70, minus your E of x. So your driving force then for potassium that we just solved up above would be negative 70 minus negative 90. So then add 90. So we're going to have 20. So then if we're looking at the cell and we put a positive 20 in here, and we have a positive calcium or potassium on the outside, is that positive want to go in, or is it going to kick it out? It's going to kick it out, because positives repel each other, right? Positive doesn't want to be with positive, positive wants to be with negative. So the driving force means we're kicking potassium out of the cell, right? And that's what we see. We see those leak channels opened up and potassium leaves, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at with driving force and Nernst equation. I hope that was satisfactory. We're going to move on now. We're going to talk a little bit about action potentials. So to talk about action potentials, we kind of have to talk about I'm going to draw a little graph here really fast. So we've got our resting membrane potential, right, at negative 70. Wow. Negative 70 millivolts RMP. And I'm going to draw a little graph here. I'm going to label it too. So action potentials happen once we hit this thing called the threshold. And threshold is the place where the activation gates on our cells open, right? And that's what causes this big spike here, right? That's where that energy, that potential that we talked about up here, where the positives and the negatives on the outside, they're lined up. We open up some gate and these positives rush in. And that causes what's called depolarization. So depolarization, hopefully I'm spelling this right, I'm kind of trying to hustle. But depolarization is when the inside of the cell becomes more positive, and thus raises us up this way, right? That's depolarization. We're becoming less polar. Whereas hyperpolarization, which is this example here, is when the inside of the cell becomes more negative. Or you can say less positive, I guess, if you want to, if that makes more sense. Whatever makes sense to you. And so in that case, it's going to move down, right? And then at this point where it's coming back down right here, this is called repolarization. So the inside of the cell is becoming more negative again, right? It's polarizing. So all those positives that rushed in, they're getting pumped out again. Everything's leaving, so it's going to come back down to the RMP eventually here at that spot, right? So I'm trying to think the best way to get this across to you guys, just how it all works. So for an action potential to be had, this number 2 has to reach the threshold. Once it reaches threshold, it goes. This action potential is an all or nothing thing. It can't just get close to the threshold and then trigger. It has to reach threshold and then it will trigger. If it doesn't reach threshold, then it will not go. That's important to remember. If we have some sort of a stimulus that causes our cell to depolarize, that's called a graded potential. So for that, something is changing, right? Something is causing our cell to depolarize. However, depending on the strength of the stimulus or the frequency of the stimulus, it may or may not cause an action potential, cause something to happen, right? So that's the difference between a graded potential and an action potential. A graded potential the cell gets depolarized, but if it only gets to here, then it's just going to come back down and go back to RMP, right? Because it didn't reach that threshold. It didn't get high enough to cause an action potential. Whereas an action potential, when it reaches threshold, it's going to shoot up and cause us to have that action potential there. And again, action potential is all or nothing. Some things that cause the depolarizing of a cell. I'm going to give a couple of examples here, just to hopefully try to make it a little clearer what I'm talking about. Let's say we have hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia means that if we have a cell, we always have a lot of potassium on the inside, right? And then we have some on the outside. Hyperkalemia means we have more potassium on the outside of the cell than we normally do, right? We don't have an accumulation of charge here. We're just saying it's more positive than it normally is. The inside of the cell is always going to have more potassium, though. They're always going to have more potassium. If it doesn't, well, you're dead, right? But if we do have more potassium on the outside of the cell than we normally do, we have hyperkalemia, which means in normal cases, when it's just, we'll say, one guy out here, we have a lot of potassium that wants to leave, right? We have high to low. But if we have this case of hyperkalemia right here, then it's going to be smaller, right? Because we have high to less small, right? And so it throws off our chemical equilibrium here, our chemical gradient. So potassium doesn't want to leave the cell as much, which means we're going to have less negatives because we have more positives inside the cell. So when we have less negative or more positive, that means our cell is going to start depolarizing, right? It's becoming less negative, right? And threshold is about negative 50 millivolts, right? Now, depending on the case, if this kept going, it could cause us to have an action potential. But if it doesn't quite reach threshold, then it'll just kind of go back down, and we had a graded potential here. Right, this is the graded potential. That's just an example of what a graded potential is, what could cause a graded potential, right? Is this hyperkalemia? And there are several other examples I could give. I'm just giving you this one really quick to hopefully kind of help you understand what's going on in the cell when there's a graded potential. So again, graded potential, something is depolarizing the cell. Something is causing the cell to become less negative, and could potentially help us reach an action potential. So I'm going to move on a little bit. When you do have an action potential, when you do reach threshold and we cause this to shoot up, I'm going to draw a new graph down here. Okay, sorry, I'm getting off a little bit here, but I just want to make sure I get everything. When you reach, we're going to talk a little bit about something called relative refractory period. And we're going to talk about absolute refractory period. I'm going to change this color. Wow. Well, I'm sorry, give me a second. Okay. So for relative refractory period, actually I'm going to talk about absolute refractory period first. Absolute refractory period means that when we're in the middle of an action potential, we can't have another one, right? Like, it's going off. It's not going to be able, we're not going to be able to cause another one to happen while this thing's going. It's in full swing. There's no stopping it at this point, right? So between these two dotted lines, that is our absolute refractory period. We are not going to be able to set off another action potential at this point. However, if we have for the relative refractory period, that means at this point, we definitely could have another action potential set off, right? Because at this point, once it's below threshold, it could set off again. If we had some really strong stimulus and something that was causing our action potentials, our threshold to be reached over and over and over again, it cannot happen here, but it could potentially happen here. Right? And so that's why it's the relative refractory period. It's great if we can get back to RMP, but we don't necessarily have to. We just have to get below threshold again before we can set off another action potential. But when we're in the midst of this rise and peak and fall, there's no way we're going to get it to go. And so that's why it's called the absolute refractory period. It's absolute. It's not happening. So that's that. I'm going to I labeled this up here a little bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1. I'm going to talk about some of these spots I already have, right? 1, 2, and 3. 1 is RMP, 2 is the graded potential, 3 is threshold. Once we hit threshold, 4 is the action potential, right? 5 and 6, they're all the action potential. I want to talk about what happens to some of these channels inside the cell at these points. Oops, give me a second. Okay, so at 1, the cell is at rest, right? It's at that resting membrane potential. There's an equilibrium for our electrochemical gradient. At 2, something is depolarizing our cell, right? So our cell is becoming more positive, less negative, however you want to think of it. Like I said, negative 70, about negative 50 for our threshold. At the threshold, we are going to set off our action potential, right? What happens is when we reach this threshold, we have what are called sodium voltage gated channels. You can think of it NAV, that's what I'm going to say, but just know that that's our sodium voltage gated channels. Those in our cell are going to open. Normally they're closed, right? But when we reach threshold, they open and sodium is going to rush in. It has a huge driving force because sodium is really big on the outside and really small on the inside. About 145 on the outside and about 10 on the inside, right? So sodium really wants to get inside of this cell. So as soon as this gate opens, it is going to rush in. But this gate is only open for a really short amount of time because it has this little ball here that once this gate opens, it's open for a second, and then this ball comes in and closes the gate. I'm going to use a different color, right? But in that short amount of time, a lot of sodium is going to rush in, and that is going to cause there to be a lot more positives in here, meaning the cell is now really depolarized, right? And that's what causes this to shoot up. So we have these sodium voltage gated channels that open at this point right here, right? And then at 5, once we reached kind of the top of our action potential, our sodium voltage gates are going to close, right? We also have these things called potassium voltage gated channels, KV, right? They do the same thing. However, they don't really open until we've reached this point up here, right? Once the sodium channels have closed, now our potassium channels open. Okay, and so potassium is now leaving the cell. So we have a bunch of potassium leaving our cell, and we start to get more negative again, right? But the thing about these potassium channels is that they close really slowly, right? They start to close about threshold, so right about here. But because they're so slow to close, we kind of go below RMP a little bit, which is hyperpolarization, right? But then our sodium potassium pump kicks back in and we reach RMP, right? And then our cell, at least at this point, it's ready to be activated again if it needs to be, right? But that's the reason we see this little dip here, is this hyperpolarization, is because those potassium channels are slow to close. And the reason we see this huge jump as soon as we reach the threshold is because those sodium channels open and sodium rushes into the cell, causing it to depolarize, getting more positive on the inside of the cell. Let's see, one last thing. We talked about graded potential and action potential, what's different between them. Last thing I really want to talk about with you guys is length constant and capacitance. So length constant is lambda. And that equals the square root of Rm over Ri. So Rm, wow, I don't know what I did there, but Rm equals the membrane's permeability or resistance. So if we have a high resistance, high Rm, then we're going to have a low amount of things coming into the cell, right? It's harder for things to cross. So I'm just going to do that. Harder to cross the membrane. So high Rm, high resistance, things aren't coming across the membrane very easily. When we have a low Rm, then it's pretty easy for things to cross. Ri is the internal resistance. I'm going to do this in a different color now. So it's the internal resistance of the cell. Think of it as if you're running through the woods versus running across a soccer field or a football field, right? Which one is going to be harder to get through? it's going to be the woods, right? Because there's trees, there's bushes, there's roots, there's fallen trees, there's all sorts of things that are kind of getting in the way, right? And they're taking up your energy. Whereas if you're just sprinting across the field, there's nothing in front of you, right? It's really easy for you to get from one end to the other. You still have to do a lot of energy, or put in a lot of energy, but you're going to get to one end, from one end to the other, a lot faster than if you were running through the woods for the same length, right? So that's why it's the length constant. If you have a high RM and a low RI, then your length constant is going to be high, right? It's going to be super fast. You're going to be able to go farther because less things are in the way. Anyways, that's what we're talking about here. So that's length constant. And I'm gonna give some examples here. Draw out a little neuron, and we'll go with that in a minute. But I also want to talk about capacitance. Capacitance is a little harder to understand. I'm going to do my best to simplify it. So hang with me. Capacitance is C equals QV, which is also equal to epsilon A over D. Right? So capacitance is basically how much or how many ions of the same charge can I pack into an area. Right? So if I have high capacitance, I'm going to draw a membrane here, then I've got a ton of these guys packed into each other, with each other, right? Versus if I have low capacitance, then I have a lot less. I'm trying to think the best way to talk about this. The reason we can have high capacitance is because we have things inside the membrane that are going to cause some of the repulsion that these things have, right? Normally they don't want to be close to each other. Positives do not want to be with positives. Negatives do not want to be with negatives. But in this case, if we have high capacitance, we have something that is allowing these to coexist a little bit easier, right? Something is decreasing these charges' reactivity to each other. Whereas for these guys, something isn't keeping them apart, or something isn't reducing their repulsion from each other, right? And so they're spread farther apart. So this is a low capacitance. This is a high capacitance. What's causing this high capacitance is inside the membrane. There's something that's absorbing that effect from the positive and the negative on the other side, right? It's happening on both sides, but it's allowing them to cram in because it's creating the ability for these things to kind of squish in. I hope that kind of makes sense. Maybe it'll make sense as I move on to this neuron. So we're going to say we have a neuron. Right, this is a big, thick neuron, right? So I'm also going to talk about how myelin influences these things, capacitance and length constant. Okay. So right here, capacitance is high. We have a lot that can fit right along here, right? But with myelin increases the distance between things here. So they're not very close, which means there's nothing to absorb the repulsion that these feel for each other, right? So they are going to be more spread out. And that's going to cause the myelin decreases capacitance. Myelin also increases Rm. So what that means is if we have an action potential down here, it's giving off this stuff, but there's a whole bunch of negatives here, and they are absorbing the action potentials. Propagation signals is what I'm going to call it, right? These waves, right? But as soon as it hits the myelin, there is no longer a ton of negatives, a ton of foliage here, right? This is now almost a clear field right here, right? There's very little in its way. And so as soon as it hits this myelin, our propagation signal gets way bigger because it is able to just fly through this, right? And because I forgot to mention up here, Ri, the only way to change Ri, the internal resistance, is to increase the size of your neuron. So again, to kind of bring up the field in the forest, if you increase, so you're running through the forest, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff in the way. If you all of a sudden increase the space without changing the number of trees and foliage, now it's a lot easier for you to get through that forest, right? Like you just spread everything out. And so you're going to have a better shot of getting through things. So same thing with this neuron. This is a really big neuron. And so it separates things. It spreads things out even more, allowing you to propagate your signal better, right? And at this point, where the myelin is, you're increasing your Rm. So you have less things coming into the membrane here at this point. So again, things are not getting in the way, thus increasing your propagation signal. In between these myelins are called nodes. These nodes are filled with sodium voltage-gated channels and other channels that, once this signal reaches, it's going to, if it's strong enough, big enough, it'll cause another action potential and then thus propagate again. And it'll just keep doing that. And these propagation signals, due to the myelin, they move super, super fast, right? And that's why we're able to react to things so quickly, is because these propagation signals, the myelin allows things to move faster. It increases the length constant, so it's going to move farther because it increases the Rm and decreases the Ri, or the Ri is decreased because the neuron's so big, and because myelin decreases the capacitance, there's less foliage in the way, right? So I hope this kind of explains things about what the RMP is. I hope you've understood that a little bit. I hope you understand what an action potential is, how it's set off, how a cell gets back to RMP. I hope you understand what a graded potential is versus an action potential, and then I hope you kind of understood what the capacitance versus length constant and how myelin helps us, why myelin is so important. Thanks for watching.